Okay, good morning, everybody. Just saying a few words to the beginning. My name is Meretoja, and I'm from the Department of Cultural History here at the University of Turku, and I'm the Vice Director of SELMA, so directing SELMA together with Hanna. And I just wanted to have a minute or two to spread the word about the JABA conference. You have in your conference bags this card, and so we were very lucky to have the next JABA World Conference in Turku. So JABA is the International Autobiography Association, and I hope many of you know of that. There's JABA Europe and JABA Pacific and JABA Americas as well at the moment. But this is the JABA World Conference, and it's going to be here at the University of Turku, second week of June 2020. And we have already our web pages open, so you can find the address here in the card. And we are trying to open the call for papers during May. So if you follow SELMA and follow the JABA list, you will be informed about everything. So I really hope that you will all join us again, come to Turku, and then you will see Turku in the summertime, so it will be the lightest time of the year, so it will be really beautiful. And I really hope to see you all there again, and you can propose panel sessions, creative panels, all kinds of things. So, and if you want to ask more, you can come and ask me during today. So, welcome to Turku again next year.
Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to the last day of the conference. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you our last keynote speaker, Jakob Lothes. He's professor of English literature at the University of Oslo, Norway. Eva-Stina, sorry, this went out. You have to sign in, sorry. Thanks. His books include Conrad's Narrative Method by Oxford University Press, 1989, and Narrative in Fiction and Film, also by Oxford University Press, 2000. He's author of numerous essays and reviews. He has edited or co-edited many volumes, including 4 volumes in the series Theory and Interpretation of Narrative, published by Ohio State University Press. He has also edited The Future of Literary Studies, which came out 2 years ago, by Novus Press, and Times Witnesses, Women's Voices from the Holocaust, by Fledgling Press, also 2017. And many of you know him from the world of narrative studies as one of the major figures of narrative ethics. So it's a great honor to have him here today, and please join me in welcoming Jakob.
Thank you very much, Hanna, for that generous introduction. It's lovely to be here, and this project, Narrative and Memory, is proving truly inspirational, I think, for all of us. There is a handout, and I hope you have one in front of you, with most of my references and my main quotations. So if you can just keep this in front of you. One reason why this conference is significant is its sustained attempt, announced in the call for papers and confirmed in all the papers I've heard so far, that we need a more extended dialogue between narrative studies and cultural memory studies by considering, I quote, the intersections of narrative, memory, and identity. As the CFP also states, and this point needs to be repeated and highlighted, narratives shape cultural memory by interpreting the past from the perspective of the present. But this memory work is never merely a matter of representing and understanding the past. It also shapes how we perceive our possibilities in the present and for the future. And it involves negotiating both collective and personal identities. A key concept in this sentence I just quoted is perspective. In narrative discourse, which continues to be useful, Jeanette defines perspective by contrasting perspective with voice. Voice indicates the narrative agent that speaks. Perspective indicates the agent that sees. Despite the problem of distinguishing between these two variants of narrative agency in analysis, not least since a narrator's voice may often signal or reveal a certain perspective, this distinction remains important. Yet two aspects need to be stressed or added to the concept. The first one is identified in the sentence I've just quoted from the CFP. The act of seeing is never neutral. It necessarily involves interpretation, and this interpretation is always historically situated. The second aspect has been identified and discussed by not least Mieke Bal. Perspective indicates not just the agent that sees, it also activates the perspective of the historical person or fictional character who is being looked at. Thus, there is a sense in which perspective involves not just one agent, but two. The relationship between them tends to be asymmetrical, not least because the perspective of the agent, that is the character who is being looked at, may not be as closely linked to a voice as is that of the agent that sees or focalizes. Partly because of this kind of asymmetry, perspective is possessed of elements of power. That this power can include agents who feel powerless is illustrated by a passage in Heart of Darkness, one of many fictional texts associated with and in different ways responding to the historical process of European imperialism. In the Grove of Death scene in Conrad's novella from 1899, Marlowe, the main narrator and main character, is looking at a group of blacks who are dying after having been forced to work as slaves for the Belgian intruders. It seemed to me, says Marlowe, I'd stepped into the gloomy circle of some inferno. Black shapes crouched, sat between the trees, leaning against the trunks, clinging to the earth, half coming out, half effaced within the dim light, in all the attitudes of pain, abandonment, and despair. They were dying slowly, it was very clear. They were not enemies, they were not criminals, they were nothing earthly now. The inferno Marlowe encounters here is a region which, in addition to mapping a geographical space at a given point in history, also, as Michel Foucault puts it, denotes, quote, the area controlled by a certain kind of power. One reason why Marlowe is profoundly shaken by what he sees here is his beginning realization that, looking at the dying blacks, his perspective is worryingly close to that of the Belgians. And that, seen from the perspective of those dying blacks, it may prove impossible to differentiate him as a white European from the other white men in the region. This effect, at once aesthetic and ethical, is further strengthened by the narrative's forceful suggestion that I, too, a white European, who, 100 years on, continues to profit from the natural resources in the Congo, for example by using my mobile phone, may be involved in like complicity. Perspective is a key concept then. In the following discussion I'll give of 4 narrative texts, 2 versions of documentary narrative, and 2 examples of narrative fiction. Before turning to my first text, I briefly comment on the 3 words of my chosen title: narrative, memory, and identity. And I link all these words, which I use as concepts, to my understanding of narrative ethics. My discussion is aided by some very helpful definitions given by contributors to Storytelling and Ethics, an excellent volume edited by Hanna Meretoja and Colin Davis. For Mieke Bal, one of the contributors, storytelling is, quote, the presentation in whatever medium of a focalized series of events, unquote. Bal identifies 2 properties of storytelling that make its ethical aspects more specific. Quote, it concerns others, and it is always, at least in part, fictional. I'll comment and elaborate on these properties as I proceed. In The Decline of Narrative and the Rise of the Archive, Ernst van Alpen, in another very good contribution to the volume, starts by emphasizing the temporal dimension of narrative. Quote, narrative can be seen as an existential response to the world and to the experience of that world. Narrative, Alpen observes, has functioned as the medium of identity. Referring to Paul Ricoeur, he calls this notion of identity narrative identity. I hasten to add that Alpen problematizes this definition by discussing the rise of the archive and the reduced possibility of identity without the person. Yet although this ongoing historical and cultural change challenges the notion of a narrative identity, that challenge doesn't in itself make the notion less significant. Similarly, there is a sense in which the challenge makes Hannah Arendt's interlinking of human identity and narrative even more thought-provoking today than it was when The Human Condition was published in 1958. Developing an argument based on premises and observations that are quite different from Ricoeur's, Arendt's claim that, quote, who somebody is or was, we can only know by knowing the story of which he himself is the hero, his biography, in other words, unquote. I agree with Hanna Meretoja that Arendt's understanding of narrative identity tends towards or aims for a non-subsumptive dialogic understanding. I also concur with Meretoja that this kind of understanding is closely related to, curiously both furthering and resulting from, the ethical mode of narrative. Both of these dimensions are illustrated and supported by the scene we just looked at from Heart of Darkness. Implicit in these comments on narrative and identity is a view of memory that links memory closely to both. It is exceedingly impossibly difficult to come to terms with the concepts of narrative and identity without activating, implicitly or explicitly, aspects of memory. If I can't conceive of narrative divorced from memory, neither can I think of identity without remembering something of myself, to allude to the marvelous title of Kipling's autobiography, before the point or stage of my life where I am just now. The human capacity for and processes of memory are endlessly complicated, and even more so if we try to consider not just individual but also collective and cultural memory. And yet, seen from the perspective of narrative, and particularly narrative ethics, memory is also a great resource, even though there is something frustratingly elusive about memory, and even though the concept resists any definition of it. Aspects of memory prove indispensable conceptual tools as we attempt to improve our understanding of narrative and identity and our own lives. I agree with Ricoeur that we shouldn't only approach memory, quote, on the basis of its deficiencies, but also, quote, approach the description of mnemonic phenomena from the standpoint of the capacities. As Ricoeur puts it, to put it bluntly, we have nothing better than memory to signify that something has taken place, has occurred, has happened before we can declare that we remember it. Now, these observations on narrative, memory, and identity underlie my work in the field of narrative ethics, and they also shape my points about the following four texts. As Jim Fallon puts it, narrative ethics is, quote, specifically concerned with the intersection between various formal aspects of narrative and moral values. While there are few narratives that don't raise ethical issues for the reader, there are few, if any, narrative whose moral values aren't shaped through narrative form. Seen from the perspective of ethics, form is crucially important. These moral values may be different in kind and scope, thus often creating tensions typically related to and expressed through the different views, actions, and attitudes of the text's characters and narrators. The ethical questions raised by a narrative are often prompted by such tensions. Questions asked by the author or director via the different agents of a narrative, and questions asked by the reader or viewer about the narrative. Turning to my first text and to Leni Riefenstahl, I posit that all five concepts identified and briefly commented on so far, narrative, identity, memory, perspective, and ethics, apply equally to users and abuses of storytelling. As you know, the main reason why the word abuse is linked to Riefenstahl's storytelling is Triumph of the Will, Triumph des Willens, a filmic rendering released in 1935 of the Nazi rally in Nuremberg in 1934. It's worth noting, though, that the abuse of storytelling in this film is much more apparent to us and to any viewer of the film after the Second World War than it was to a German audience in 1935 or 1936 or 1937, that is, the late 1930s. In addition to suggesting one reason why the film became successful as Nazi propaganda, this temporal difference and difference in as regards information tells us something important about the connection between ethics and aesthetics. While Riefenstahl's aesthetic presentation doesn't constitute a coherent ethical system, it generates and shapes an ethics that is ideological and political in the values that it furthers, embodies, and represents. These values include celebration of strength and of the leader, Hitler in particular, and aesthetization of events and movements that were far from neutral, but actually carefully planned in order to impress and manipulate. A filmic narrative written that almost irresistibly makes the viewer follow the camera's movements in a way that makes him or her susceptible to the camera's manipulative force, and remarkably effective use of perspective and distance variations of long shots and close-ups as key elements of film form. A few stills from the film will illustrate these points. This is the title of the film. The beginning is extremely suggestive and effective. Hitler arriving in a plane, aircraft, as if from heaven. Hitler in the middle, walking towards the camera, flanked by thousands of soldiers on both sides. The new, strong Germany, led by the Führer. Low-angle shot of Hitler, heaven, background, Hitler as savior. The sequence showing Hitler walking towards the camera becomes much more effective because of the way Riefenstahl has prepared the viewer for it. Hitler has descended from heaven to liberate his people. Now he's walking towards the viewer, the German people, in order to implement that task. And again, the significance of perspective, especially low-angle shots. And then there is a very striking verbal text at the very end. The aim must be all decent Germans become members of the Nazi party. This is perhaps the point of the film where the propaganda element becomes explicit and overt, even more than earlier on. In Olympia, the official film of the Olympic Games in Berlin in 1936, the Nazi propaganda, or to put it differently, the elements of abuse in Riefenstahl's storytelling are subtler. One reason for this significant difference is that the filmic presentation is more nuanced and less one-dimensional in Olympia than in Triumph of the Will. There is a sense in which this kind of filmic complexity, which isn't just aesthetic but also ethical, reduces the distance between the spectator who was there in the stadium in 1936 and the viewer of Riefenstahl's film, who can of course be anywhere at different points in time. This facet of Olympia is particularly striking in Riefenstahl's presentation of Jesse Owens, the black American runner who won 4 gold medals in Berlin. Seen from a Nazi perspective, the world's most eminent sprinter shouldn't be a black. And yet Riefenstahl's filmic presentation of Jesse Owens suggests respect, even admiration. What remains constant, though, is the celebration of the strong human body, as shown, for example, in this still. Stylized images. And this celebration is linked to that of a new, strong Germany, with Hitler as the great, invincible Führer. While Riefenstahl, in Triumph of the Will, uses constituent elements of film narrative to ask the viewer to endorse the values of Nazism as personified by Hitler, the propaganda element is less conspicuous, though perhaps equally suggestive and effective in Olympia. The latter film too, she stages a version of reality that suits her purpose as director. That the fictional element in Riefenstahl's narrative in Olympia is less apparent doesn't make it less significant, particularly as regards the mythical connection that Riefenstahl aims to construct at the film's beginning between ancient Greece and modern Germany as powerful center of culture. Riefenstahl's filmic narrative furthers a strong sense of national identity, as this slide shows, and this celebration of regained German identity, lurking behind or underneath this, is the memory of Germany's defeat just a few years earlier in the First World War. Colin Davis's definition of ethics as, quote, a set of problems concerning right and wrong, good and bad, rather than the prospect of their solution, unquote, is critically productive if applied to all my 4 texts, not least these 2 films by Riefenstahl. You could counter that Riefenstahl does indeed present the viewer with a solution to problems concerning right and wrong. But since that solution is Nazism, it's ethically charged in a way that approximates to abuse of storytelling. This point is linked to a problem that I've touched on already, as I now turn from Riefenstahl to Edith Notowicz's testimony, and also to the 2 fictional texts by Sebald and Erpenbeck. One possible way of phrasing the problem is to ask, how can I, from my post-World War II perspective, which includes knowledge of the Holocaust, adequately assess Riefenstahl's uses and abuses of storytelling in films made before the war? Moreover, how can I, given this limited perspective, identify and discuss possible abuses of storytelling in the accounts of Holocaust survivors, who I respect and whose testimonies I am inclined to believe? The Holocaust was a historical event, but there doesn't exist just one narrative of this event. As Holocaust survivor Stenka Fantlova puts it, 6 million were murdered. If all of them had survived, there would have been 6 million different narratives. While in one sense this comment would seem true, in a different sense it is not. It's true that the narratives would have been different, but not all Holocaust survivors are able to transform their experience into a narrative. Whether this kind of inability or failure reduces their identity, I'm not sure. Though it may problematize their narrative identity by making it more fragmented and less coherent. There is even a troubling sense in which it may problematize the experience. Although experience extends beyond narrative, once or if remembered, it tends to take on narrative shape. To put this another way, the enormous challenge of transforming a traumatic experience of this kind into narrative, however fragmented and disconnected, is a warning against indiscriminate use of the concept of narrative identity. Human identity is not just dependent on narrative. However, narrative can make aspects of human identity clearer to the teller, and thus also to the listener or reader or viewer. In order to illustrate this point, I want to briefly discuss just one passage from one testimony in this book, Time's Witnesses, Women's Voices from the Holocaust. Before turning to that passage, I need to say a few words about the book, which was prompted by my wish to document a historical event, that is the Norwegian Holocaust. During the autumn and winter of 42-43, 772 Norwegian Jews were deported from Norway to Nazi camps, most of them to Auschwitz. Of these 772, 34 survived. Most of them, 532, were deported aboard this ship, the Donau. You can see a photo of it here leaving Oslo harbour on the 26th of November 1942. Now, of the Jews deported from Norway, no children and no women survived Auschwitz. For that reason, there are no witnesses for these two groups of Norwegian Jews. The approximately 300 women and children who were deported were murdered. Here there is a narrative void, a silence, and no narratives, no autobiographies. However, 4 Jewish women who survived the Holocaust and who settled in Norway after the war were somewhat reluctantly willing to meet me and tell me their stories. One of them was Edith Notowicz. On your left, you can see a photo of Edith taken by Norwegian photographer Agnete Brun at the time she told her story. On your right, you can see a photo of Edith taken just before the war. She had just one photo of herself as a young woman in Hungary in the late 1930s. I think of Notowicz's narrative as a fractured line from the photo on your right, her face before the camp experience, and to the photo on your left, her face at the time when she attempts to remember and narrate. Although I, as a Norwegian born after the war, couldn't possibly know what questions to ask the women, I had to ask a few questions to make the narratives possible. And these are the questions. Can you describe the circumstances that led up to your arrest? Can you tell me how you experienced your imprisonment? Can you say a little about your life after the war? And 4, when you look back at your time in the prison camp, what do you feel is particularly important not to forget? What can we learn from what you and your fellow prisoners were subjected to? And this takes me to the passage I want to share with you and comment on. This is from Notowicz's autobiographical first-person narrative. The notorious Dr. Josef Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death, operated in Auschwitz. Operated in 2 senses of the word. I soon made his acquaintance. Mengele used children in his medical experiments. He had a special predilection for twins, but I can't go into details here. It is too horrible for me. He was also interested in finding new methods of sterilization and thereby preventing the Jewish race from procreating. In the camp, he had more than enough test subjects, and I was one of those who were used in Mengele's sterilization experiments on Jewish girls. The pain is still with me, and in the dead of night, it sometimes is as if I'm back in the experimentation room in the camp. I make 2 comments on this narrative segment, or episode. First, it's possible for me, as a listener to Notowicz's story, and as a reader of Time's Witnesses, not to believe this part of her narrative. If she were not one of the Jewish girls used in Mengele's experiments in Auschwitz, then the passage would be a glaring example of abuse of storytelling. In a way, this part of her narrative is beyond belief, and I was strongly reminded of this aspect of her story when I met Edith, who has become a good friend, in a flat in Trondheim just before Christmas. She is still on remarkably good form. One indication of the force of this possibility, that is the possibility of fictional intrusion into a first-person narrative that claims to be a testimony, is that Edith Notowicz herself asks that very question in the next paragraph of her story. Is it true or not? What was the driving force behind the Nazis' intense attempt to exterminate other people? Is it possible that humans can be like this? Often I can't believe it. But I've been there, so I know it happened. This last sentence takes me to the second comment on the passage. Although I can't believe it either, I choose to do so. For me, the trustworthiness of her story is strengthened by her own disbelief and by the questions she asks. Moreover, the reliability of her narrative is, for me, paradoxically strengthened by a narrative ellipsis. If we go back to this slide, I can't go into details here. It is too horrible for me. This ellipsis approximates to what Jeanette calls a parallipsis. That is a textual omission that takes on a particular significance precisely because it is omitted. Notowicz indicates that she knows details of Mengeles' experiments with twins that she can't and doesn't want to narrate. As a listener and reader, I respect her decision not to elaborate. I would even argue that the choice of excluding this event of her story makes her testimony more credible. The omitted or excluded parts of her memories of Mengele are reserved for or can't be excluded from her thoughts and dreams in the dead of night. That these memories are deeply traumatic doesn't, however, render Notowicz's account of Mengeles' experiments on Jewish women and children in Auschwitz less credible or less important. If Riefenstahl deftly abuses film narrative in order to manipulate historical reality by furthering the version of history, and particularly German history, presented by the Nazis, Notowicz uses a much simpler oral and then in the book written narrative in order to give testimony about the most extreme consequence of Nazi values and Nazi ideology, that is, the Holocaust. For Sebald, the German-British author who was born in Bavaria in 1944, emigrated to the UK in the 1960s, and died in a traffic accident outside Norwich in 2001, the Holocaust is a phantom that infiltrates his writings. Apparently irrepressible, traces of this historical event are scattered across Sebald's work. In Austerlitz, his last completed work and a major novel of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the Holocaust becomes an empty center, a void towards which the narration hesitantly yet inevitably gravitates. As those of you who have read Austerlitz will know, the reader of the novel also becomes a viewer, since the text includes a number of black and white photographs and illustrations. These uncaptioned illustrations are linked to, and thus in one sense purport to represent, places or elements of space in historical reality. These places, aspects of history associated with them also, are not only framed by the fictional narrative also guides our interpretation of them. Although Sebald's narrative rhetoric includes elements of manipulation, as most narratives do, and although narrative manipulation may involve abuse of storytelling, I consider the narration of Austerlitz and the framed narrator, and Sebald as the implied author representing both of them, as deeply ethical in the positive sense of the word. The values of narrative are not necessarily good values or values to which I want to subscribe. Neither are my own values just good values. And yet, as far as this novel is concerned and my reading of it, there is a link between the values associated with Austerlitz and increasingly with the frame narrator and Austerlitz as a storytelling project. Now, Austerlitz is the name of the protagonist, a German or a Czech Jew who lost both his parents in the Holocaust. Strikingly, the character in the novel who most forcibly represents the moral values promoted by the narrative is absent from it. This character is Agatha, Austerlitz's mother, who saves her son's life by securing a place for him on a Kindertransport from Prague to the UK in the summer of 1939. Agatha's ethics is diametrically opposed to that of the Nazis. Although we should be wary of comparing directly narratives as different as Notowicz's testimony and Sebald's novel, there is a sense in which Austerlitz and the frame narrator's storytelling represents the ethics of Austerlitz's parents, while Notowicz's storytelling represents the moral values of the 300 Norwegian Jewish women and children who couldn't bear testimony because they were murdered on arrival in Auschwitz. Austerlitz's search for his parents takes him to Theresienstadt, which was a ghetto, now a museum, in the north of the Czech Republic. And this map then becomes part of the narrative. It's in the middle of the longest sentence in the novel, which is around 7 pages. Austerlitz here in Theresienstadt manages to obtain a copy of a film made by the Nazis in the camp in 1944. Watching the film, he can't see his mother, Agatha, anywhere. But then he has an extended or artificially extended, slowed down version made for him. And watching that version, he can see, he thinks, the face of a young woman. The visual image is accompanied by this passage. This is page 351 of Austerlitz. Around her neck, said Austerlitz, she is wearing a 3-stringed and delicately draped necklace. That one, back one. Which scarcely stands out from her dark, high-necked dress. And there is, I think, a white flower in her hair. She looks, so I tell myself as I watch, just as I imagined the singer Agatha from my faint memories and the few other clues to her appearance that I now have. And I gaze again and again at that face, which seems to be both strange and familiar, said Austerlitz. It turns out that the woman isn't Agatha, since Vera, that's a friend of Austerlitz in Prague, can't recognize her. Moreover, the words imagined and faint memories suggest that Austerlitz isn't sure either. The face in the image seems to be approaching the viewer from an unknown place, somewhere in the past, strengthening Austerlitz's desire to learn more about the last phase of his mother's life. If the need to remember here seems to triumph the process of forgetting, thus signaling for Austerlitz a possible defeat of time, his failure to identify the woman as his mother affirms the sense of irretrievable loss that prevails throughout Austerlitz. It is illustrative of the novel's storytelling resources that a fictional character, such as Austerlitz, thinks he can recognize his mother in a documentary film made by the Nazis. Thus, there is a sense in which the historical film is fictionalized, while at the same time linking Austerlitz to historical reality. Moreover, fictionalization is also very much part of the film itself. As a Nazi propaganda film, it presents a picture of Theresienstadt that is entirely false. Before making the film, the Nazi authorities fixed up the camp to give it the appearance of a happy community. In the fictional world of the novel, Austerlitz thinks that Agatha was, quote, sent east in September 1944. In historical reality, both before and after shooting the film, the Nazis deported a large number of the camp's inmates to Auschwitz. Sebald's incorporation of this documentary into the fiction of Austerlitz testifies to a strong ethical concern. His ethical concern as implied author builds on and combines the ethics of Agatha, who is absent from the narrative, the ethics of her son Austerlitz, who is searching for her, and the ethics of the German narrator, who becomes Austerlitz's friend and proves himself to be worthy of Austerlitz's trust because he passes on Austerlitz's narrative to the reader. Looking at this page from Austerlitz, we are confronted both with abuse and use of storytelling at the same time. Sebald's novel investigates not just the relations between history and fiction, but also the relations between truth and falsity. The documentary made by the Nazis has a historical existence, but its purpose wasn't to fictionalize, but to lie. While Sebald's narrative is fictional, but its purpose is to capture truths and ask ethical questions that the documentary either denies or neglects. The film's abuse of storytelling becomes even more striking if, as a reader and viewer, I possess extra-textual knowledge about its director. The film's original title is Der Führer schenkt den Juden eine Stadt, written and directed by Jewish actor Kurt Garron, who had played opposite Marlene Dietrich in Joseph von Sternberg's Der blaue Engel from 1930. This is the film. Forcing Garron to make the film, the Nazis promised him his life. After filming was completed on September the 11th, 1944, Garron was deported to Auschwitz, and he was murdered in Birkenau on the 28th of October 1944. Thus, the lie presented in the documentary is confirmed by the Nazis' lie to the person who enabled them to make it. By way of concluding, I want to link the examples of storytelling presented so far to one of the most compelling voices in current European fiction, that of the German author Jenny Erpenbeck. I'll comment on the ethical dimension of just two constituent elements of Erpenbeck's 2012 novel, Aller Tag Abend, or in English translation, The End of Days. The first textual segment is an element of paratext, an epigraph from Sebald's Austerlitz. We left from here for Marienbad only last summer. And now, where will we be going now? This is a question asked by Austerlitz. In a thought-provoking study entitled The Ethics of Travel, Syed Islam distinguishes between sedentary travel and nomadic travel. While the sedentary traveller would typically be a representative of mass tourism, a nomadic traveller could be, for example, a member of the Samic people who travels with his reindeer in Utsjoki in northern Finland. For Islam, only the nomadic travel is ethical in the proper sense of the word. Illuminating as it is, this bipartite distinction is oversimplified, as Erpenbeck's epigraph from Austerlitz shows. There is a strong sense in which the journeys, both in Austerlitz and in Aller Tage Abend, are neither sedentary nor nomadic, and yet they are significant, at once furthering and characterizing the narratives of the two novels. Austerlitz's vague memories of Marienbad form part of his identity as a Jewish child in Czechoslovakia before the war. The question in line 2 of the epigraph from Austerlitz is a multifaceted ethical question that applies to characters and narrators in both these novels. In Austerlitz, Agatha and her son may be asking themselves this very question as Austerlitz embarks on the Kindertransport from Prague to England in the summer of 1939. 5 years later, Agatha may be asking the same question as she is being deported to an unknown destination in the east. Many years after the war, Austerlitz is asking the same question as he keeps searching for his parents, a futile quest that takes him as far east as Theresienstadt. One important reason why Aller Tage Ende gives such a rich response to this question, asked in a different novel by Sebald, published approximately a decade earlier, is suggested by Erpenbeck's original use of intermezzoes, reflective passages that punctuate and yet interlink the different stages of the novel's plot. My brief comments on the novel's use of intermezzoes blend into a concluding reflection. Simply put, these intermezzoes consider the possibility that the main character, a Jewish woman who dies early in the novel, may not have died after all. While Sebald uses the resources of narrative fiction to stage a prolonged conversation and negotiation between a European Jew who lost both his parents in the Holocaust and a German man born after the war, Erpenbeck, also inspired by Aristotle's insistence on what might happen in literature, develops a compelling story of much of the 20th century presented from the perspective of one female character, a woman who, in common with Austerlitz, is also Jewish and who, like him, makes a narrow escape from the Holocaust. In contrast to Austerlitz, the main character in Aller Tag Ende escapes death several times. More precisely, she dies, but then the implied author gives her a new lease of life. While not exactly explaining how that is possible, outside fiction it is not, but invention is a privilege of the writer of fiction. Erpenbeck uses the intermezzoes to shrewdly reflect on the many different courses a life can take. Thus, the novel's plot approximates to a series of narrative beginnings whose ethical component is strengthened by the main character's determination to make a contribution to a safer, saner, and more just society. In each beginning, the question from Austerlitz is asked. The insistent repetition of the question in the epigraph throughout Aller Tag Ende makes it impossible for me not to link the question, not just to the characters and narrators in the novels, and not only to Sebald and Erpenbeck as implied authors, but also to my own reflections as a reader. Seen from my perspective, where am I going? And responding to Sebald's use of we in the epigraph, where are we going as Europeans? Where is Europe going? That such reflections assume the form of questions doesn't make them less irrelevant or invalid. The challenge, though, at least from my Norwegian perspective, is how to transform ethical reflection into ethical action, particularly forms of action oriented towards others and towards the future. For me, the most important reason why narrative ethics is a key aspect of literary studies and of the humanities is narrative ethics' insistence on a close link between the ethics of all kinds of narratives, fictional and non-fictional, and problems and challenges in the real world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jakob, for a wonderful paper. We have now some time for questions and comments. Who would like to start? Mark.
I'll ask this cautiously. I mean, one could argue that the kind of hybrid text that we find in Austerlitz on some level represents a kind of ideal vehicle for speaking to the Holocaust, and it has to do with the relationship between history and fiction. You know, there's a kind of magnetism that gets set up whereby the fictional becomes assimilated to the historical and the historical to the fictional, and that in turn unleashes a kind of unusual energy, it seems to me, that's especially productive. Now, I certainly wouldn't want to say ideal in the sense of there shouldn't be pure fiction and there shouldn't be history. But I wonder if you can speak to that energy that gets set up in Austerlitz as a uniquely valuable vehicle for speaking to reality.
Well, thank you for that comment, Mark. Very well seen. I think it is not but one way of approaching this, in one sense, impossible task. It is as though Sebald extremely ambitiously tries to combine elements of visual narrative and verbal narrative, linking both to both fiction and history. And I can only speak for myself. I think this is done in a wonderful way. I know good friends, highly intelligent people, who are much more critical of Austerlitz. They are provoked, for example, by these images they can't identify. So a lot depends on your attitude. I'm not necessarily saying that my reading is better than theirs, but I would certainly agree with both with your point and the way you phrase it. I think it is simply wonderful. It's deeply melancholic, and that melancholy moves towards both a kind of grief, prolonged grief, process of grieving, and I'm thinking of this word used by Ricoeur, which I think he has from Freud. I think you, Andrea, at least touched on this. Durcharbeiten, working through. Austerlitz is, as it were, working through. But what I think is especially original and even daring in Austerlitz is the way in which Sebald brings together these two protagonists, because the German also becomes a very, very important character, Austerlitz and the German, and there is a friendship being formed between them. It's not necessarily, I think both use or avoid the word forgiveness, which is extremely loaded, as you know, difficult in Holocaust memory literature. But there is a growing friendship and an element of trust. He gives the narrator all his photographs, which are extremely valuable to him. And the narrator passes on the narrative to the reader. And this element of trust is also an element of hope in Austerlitz that to some extent counteracts the melancholy.
Okay, we have time for one more question, Jens. Sorry, okay, maybe two quick questions. Jens was first.
Well, Jakob, thank you very much for this very thoughtful and very sensitive rendering of the world of Austerlitz and Sebald. You mentioned that it is about narrative fiction. When you would be asked to classify this sort of writing, Mark brought up history and fiction, and it is of course both. I mean, there's a third reading, or even many more readings, that would say Austerlitz, the novel. I say novel. It's not a novel. It was not a novel for Sebald. Sebald was very, very keen on avoiding the classification and the labeling in a certain genre. He simply called it, in all his interviews, in all his comments, in all his writing, a text or even more prose. So he he was very insisting. Even the publisher Fischer wanted to call it a novel, a roman. No way, not. I mean, he was very temperamental, a very energetic person. He wanted to change the publisher, the language, the word, everything. No novel. So I think the third reading would be to assume there is much more between fiction and history than just what these two concepts suggest, that they are a sort of a broad variety, a broad range of narrative options, imaginative options, that he explored on the way and passing, but without making it a study in narratology or in imagination. But this third option would be, again, neither fiction nor history, but what would you think as a narrative ethicist? What is this but?
Our good colleague in Denmark, who's part of this new exciting project here, Henrik Skov Nielsen, he and his colleagues have introduced the concept of fictionality, arguing that it's not a question of either or, but rather a kind of scale. And that concept could prove useful in order to explore what you are suggesting, and I agree entirely. The reason why I, perhaps in a slightly conservative way, call it a novel is simply that Austerlitz as a character and main person is invented by Sebald. Now, the frame narrator, then it becomes a bit more complicated, because this German is not identified, but in the last paragraph, suddenly there appears in parentheses the numbers 18, 4, 44. And if you happen to know, as I do, that that was Sebald's birth date, then the link between the frame narrator, the German narrator, and Sebald is strengthened. So it is endlessly complicated. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry, but we have to finish now and move on to the next session. But let's thank Jakob Markusma. So we will just rearrange the chairs, but if you want to stand up and go quickly to the toilet, that's fine.
Jakob.
Thank you for a lovely talk. I actually work on very similar work, but it's not very difficult. My work is
You have to send me because I couldn't.
so the themes are all very similar, and sometimes even more complex. The way that the story is told is often mediated through Europeans. Because become there, the ethical questions are very complicated. I just really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Have you been to Rwanda?
Yeah, I've been working there for about 10 years now. I'm actually working, my first book is about testimonies of Rwandan survivors. I work with a charity that collects testimonies, audio-visual testimonies. The charity is a British charity, but they actually run the genocide.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's good. Yeah, that's perfect. Very good, very good. Yeah. No, oh.
Very interesting order for our library.
Right. And I'm now currently working on a biography about colleague.
Is it possible to see how maybe it looks big?
I don't know.
That is very good. Yes. That's great. Thank you very much. You did this. That's really good.
Hans olisi tänne, että oli huono ilma, että voiko sitä, mutta en mä usko, me voidaan tehdä siitä. Mutta onko tuolla joku sellainen?
Really good.
These issues are coming up now because these children. Yes, so I work with this charity.
I have never been there, but my wife works in charity.
turn it off when I'm done. Hello, everyone. We're going to soon start the roundtable. Yeah. So I'd like to welcome everybody then to the roundtable discussion we're going to have here, and to emphasize that it is going to be a discussion among two authors. Hanna Meretoja, and her book is behind her, hovering like a ghost. The Ethics of Storytelling, Narrative Hermeneutics, History and the Possible. And Hans Ruin, Being with the Dead, Burial, Ancestral Politics, and the Roots of Historical Consciousness. The idea for this crazy roundtable came from me. And I'm very, very grateful that the authors and the careful, loving readers have agreed to do this. Basically, the idea occurred in the following way. I saw that Hanna had a book coming out, and then that Hans's book 2 weeks ago was published. And so I wrote to, my name is Siobhan Katago, by the way, from University of Tartu. I wrote then to Hans and to Hanna and to Eneken and said, what do you think about this idea that we get together and celebrate and have a conversation with these authors? And then they agreed, and then Colin agreed, and Molly agreed, and Eneken agreed that we're all going to read the books, and we're all going to talk about them. So it's really a roundtable of readers and writers. Okay, so it's not really a panel. It's a conversation, and I would say it's a celebration. The sun has even come out, right, to celebrate the publication of these books. All of us in this little roundtable were here in 2017 in Tallinn, and we heard the early fruits, the early blossoms of these of papers that then have blossomed into books in Turku. Yeah, so. Hanna Meretoja from Turku, everybody knows her. Hans Ruin from Södertörn University in the Department of Philosophy. Eneken Laanes, you all know her as well, University of Tallinn, Department of Comparative Literature. Molly Andrews, you all know her. University of East London, something psychology, a weird name.
Well, Center for Narrative Research, and I'm a political psychologist.
That's it. And Colin Davis, Royal Holloway, Comparative Literature. You have also some strange, long, modern languages, humanities, something.
Yes.
Yeah, all right. Yeah.
Strange.
Okay. So Hanna will first speak a little bit and introduce her book. Then Hans will do the same. I might say a few little words of, I want to quickly... I hope you're going to talk about one thing, Hanna. You got rid of the picture. Okay, let it go. I'm going to talk about that, the picture of your book, in my little thing. Not now. No, you're going to go into your splendid PowerPoints, and then Eneken, Molly, Colin, you're going to help us and close. Yeah. All right.
Okay. Thank you so much, and I have to say that it is quite embarrassing to be talking so much about my own work in a conference that I'm organizing, but she forced me. So. Okay, so just to very briefly tell you some of the key ideas about the book. So the starting point for this book was the observation that narratives have immense power in the contemporary world, and I wanted to take part in this current discussion on what narratives actually do to us, ethically speaking, what kind of ethical potential and dangers they might have, both literary narratives and narratives more generally. So in the recent years, there have been a lot of discussion on this topic of narrative ethics, but often it has been dominated by sometimes quite sort of black and white views on whether narrative form in itself somehow makes narratives beneficial or harmful for us. So I wanted to participate in this discussion by trying to sort of flesh out both the potential and dangers at kind of different dimensions, how we might analyze and evaluate them. My starting point was that narrative form in itself does not make narratives either beneficial or harmful. It's always contextual, how we use narratives. So that's why this book is very much about uses and abuses of narratives, because I think it should always be contextually evaluated what narratives do. So my approach stems from the phenomenological hermeneutic tradition, and this is a very important point of connection between my book and Hans Ruen's book. So while hermeneutics refers to theoretical reflection on interpretation, the phenomenon of interpretation, narrative hermeneutics is something that I have been trying to develop with colleagues here, for example, with Jens Brockmeyer and Mark Freeman, argues that not only we interpret narratives, but narratives themselves are also culturally mediated interpretative practices. So they're about interpreting human possibilities, the human modes of being in the world. At the center of my book is the question of how narratives shape what I call a sense of the possible. So with this concept, I mean both a sense of what it is possible to experience, do, feel, think in a certain historical and cultural world, but also a sense of how things could be otherwise. And from this perspective, crucial, the ethical potential of literature, for example, is how it can open up new possibilities of being, thinking, experiencing. And I'm interested, yesterday I talked a little bit about narrative agency, so I'm interested in how narrative identity and narrative agency and a sense of the possible, which are, in my framework, interconnected, how this narrative agency and narrative identity is shaped by the relationship between a narrative unconscious and narrative imagination. And these are concepts that many colleagues here have developed, Mark Freeman, especially the narrative unconscious, and Molly Andrews and Jens Brockmeyer, for example, the narrative imagination. So I very much draw on their work. And the narrative concept of narrative unconscious signals that cultural mechanisms that regulate how we narrate our experiences and share them with others affects us largely unconsciously. So these cultural narrative models that surround us, we are only partly aware of them. Such models of what is good life, success, and so on. So there are conceptions of who we are and who we could be, what's possible for us. By making these models visible, literary narratives can enrich our narrative imagination and our culturally available repertoire of narrative sense-making models. And this is one crucial ethical potential of literature. So it can help us have more agentic power over the narrative environments that surround us. So I developed this model of 6 sort of evaluative continuums on which we can evaluate and analyze and place narratives on these continuums. So we can look at whether narratives expand or diminish our sense of the possible, whether they cultivate or distort our self-understanding, both personal and cultural self-understanding, whether they promote or impair our ability to understand the experiences of others in their singularity. And in connection to this third point, I developed this idea of non-subsumptive understanding. So narratives can be also on the scale from subsumptive to non-subsumptive. So with this difficult concept, I mean that not all narratives are about subsuming something singular under a general narrative script or model, but they can also engage with the singularity and temporality of the person we are trying to understand, or the experiences, trying to make justice to that singularity. And fourth, we can evaluate whether they participate in building inclusive or exclusive narrative in-betweens. So whether they, for example, build this narratives of us versus them, or whether they sort of create possibilities for solidarity across difference and so on. And fifth, whether they cultivate or impede our perspective awareness, our awareness of how every story can be told from a multiplicity of perspectives. And finally, sixth, whether they function as a form of ethical inquiry or dogmatism. And here the idea that the kind of ethical space of ethical questions that narratives can open, particularly literary narratives, is more valuable, finding new ways of asking these ethical questions than providing solutions to ethical problems. And I test this model, which I hope will be applicable across different kinds of narratives, not only literary narratives, but in my book I particularly tested to 21st century literary and autobiographical texts that deal with 20th century historical trauma, such as the Holocaust and the Second World War. So I discuss it in relation to works by Julia Frank, Günter Grass, Jonathan Littell, David Grossman, who all explore in different ways the role of narratives in our lives, for example, against the backdrop of Nazi Germany and the Israel-Palestine conflict. And in dialogue with them, I show how, in order to understand the legacy of the Second World War and the intersecting histories of violence that shape us, we should try to understand the perspectives of not only the victims, but also those of the perpetrators and bystanders and different kinds of implicated subjects. Because only then can we really engage with the conditions of possibility of how was it possible that something so incomprehensible happened, and to try to avoid history from repeating itself. And finally, the book tries to bring together discussions in narrative ethics, literary narrative studies, narrative psychology, narrative philosophy, and cultural memory studies. So I try to show the relevance of the hermeneutic tradition of theorizing narrative to narrative studies more broadly, because I have to say that hermeneutic approach is not very popular in literary narratology. But I think they should engage more with that tradition. And I try to develop this kind of hermeneutic dialogical conception of subjectivity and agency, and to explore how it is as dialogic storytellers, fundamentally vulnerable, interdependent, and implicated in violent histories, that we become who we are as individuals and communities. And I hope the book provides analytic tools for exploring the ethical stakes of the debate on the narrative dimension of human existence, and particularly the ways in which literary narrative fiction can expand our sense of the possible. Thank you.
Should we put back the PowerPoint to the picture? Yeah.
The book covers either have a PowerPoint.
So, sorry?
You want to stand or sit?
No, I can. It's a little bit better to stand actually, because then I see everyone.
Also, if you don't have PowerPoint set, we can also sort of be here when we. Oh, do you want to go? We have this microphone, right?
Sorry, I haven't lost it.
Now I stand, so I'll stand. It's okay. So I feel good. So I think my voice carries. Is that okay? No. No? Okay.
Now you have to turn it on. There's a button. Yeah.
So, okay. So thank you very much, Siobhan, for suggesting this. I'm grateful to be able to talk for the first time about this very newly released book. And as Hanna said, what brings us together and what I hope we will be able to discuss is the sort of the different ways of cultivating the legacy of hermeneutic and phenomenological philosophy. And when I look at the things I have done over the course now of a quarter of a century, I feel I'm doing the same thing over and over again, like somebody just polishing one and the same lens. Actually, it's the chapter 5 in the second part of Being in Time, those of you who read this book on historicity, that's sort of been the companion of my life, this text I'm trying to understand over and over again. I wrote a dissertation about it a long time ago on the problem of Geschichtlichkeit in Heidegger. And This text, as you know, those of you who read it, was crucial for Gadamer's hermeneutic project. For Ricoeur, Time and Narrative, it's a key text, one that he sort of goes over and over again. It was also what Derrida was working on in his early years. So it's a extremely dense analysis. And I think why this analysis of historicity is so compelling to many people to return to myself is that it's trying to raise the fundamental question of what is the possibility of history, historical awareness, and the fact that we experience ourselves as historical beings. And what Heidegger is trying to do in this text is sort of taking the science of history, the science of the past, and bringing it back into both an epistemological and existential question, asking, how is this possible? How is it that we can live with a sense of things having been and with responsibility for them and its continuation? And in a small passage, but actually, what Heidegger says in that text is that this is possible only on the condition that we repeat possibilities that are served from us from the past, that we move forward toward the future. So there is a sense in which we stand in a repetitive relation to those having been. And this is his key formulation in that chapter. And then he has another chapter that deals only with our own experience of death. And in that chapter he speaks about how is it that we relate to the dead. And he says, well, the dead are not simply something which, they are not just external objects to us, but the dead are somehow something with whom we live. There is a Sein mitten Toten. And this is something that he discusses in a completely different part of the book. But for me, this sort of triggered my imagination. Is there a possibility of writing somehow a social ontology of the way that we are with the dead, that somehow can generate new ways or deeper ways of thinking about historicity as the condition of somehow being with and continuing the life of those who have been before us? My dissertation was published around the same time as Derrida's book Spectres of Marx came out, and you will know the sort of the core argument of that book, where he compares the legacy of Marxism with the reading of Shakespeare's Hamlet, using the idea of the ghost, the father who comes back, haunting the son to take revenge, but also to continue the legacy of the dead. And Derrida makes this into a cultural, philosophical reflection of how our lives is spectral. They are characterized by that which comes back from the past. The past is not linear, chronological, but it has a structure of repetition and a compelling responsibility. For me, these two sort of philosophical sources, I think what brought me on track towards this project. And what made it possible to write this book was that about 10 years ago, I organized with some colleagues a huge interdisciplinary project in Sweden that got a lot of funding that we called Time, Memory and Representation. I think we were 25 scholars from 12 different disciplines, philosophers, historians of ideas, anthropologists, a lot of people from literary studies, theologians, whatever, archaeologists. And in that context, sort of, it gave me a kind of self-confidence to move into the different fields that I felt was necessary if something like a social ontology of being with the dead as the key to historical awareness could be developed. Because the philosophical sources didn't really sort of get me all the way. And Derrida suggests in his book, maybe there could be something like a phenomenology of spectrality, extending Husserlian analysis, but he doesn't do it. So I felt, how can such a project be accomplished? Well, you have to go into many different fields. And at this point, I thought maybe some people had dealt with this, but it turned out it's a huge field, of course. The study of how we relate to the dead more or less recapitulates the history of humanities. The sociology of religion, anthropology, archaeology, which is basically a science of dealing with the bones of the dead, classifying them, organizing them, placing them in archives. So this book sort of led me on this grand tour of the sort of the last 2 centuries of humanities, and discovering at every different juncture how these humanities also had tried to deal with their own position vis-à-vis the dead. and especially in anthropology, if you read the archive of anthropology, there's a complete obsession with death rights, and especially around the last turn of the century, with huge anthologies on this work, and especially in the Durkheim circle, people were working on this. So. But I think what also made it possible for me to organize this material was the help of cultural memory studies, of which I was completely unaware when I did my thesis in philosophy, because these fields don't really collaborate. But we worked a little bit with the Assmans. They came to Stockholm. We had them there. And you know, Jan Assmann has this, and both Jan and Aleida have different versions of speaking about how the relation to the dead is both retrospective and prospective. There is a retrospective aspect in the sense that we engage as living beings with those who have been before us in acts of commemoration, of grief, of recapitulation, but there is also a prospective aspect in which we as living act so as to project ourselves into a future where we no longer exist. So the production of legacy and the culture of grief and mourning are two sides of a more complex arc of this social ontology of being with the dead. And this made it possible to organize this material. And so now I have in this book 7 chapters that are the philosophical roots that are taken from phenomenology and hermeneutics, with a discussion of Levinas, Patočka, Heidegger. And then I have chapters on ancestor worship, on the culture of the dead. Burial is sort of a recurrent theme. A long chapter on archaeology that also brings archaeology up to the point where this discipline sort of confronted its own ethical dilemma, in the sense that archaeology had collected for 100 years these huge archives of bones. And you're familiar with these battles over the bones that were first initiated in the United States in the 70s with the American Indians movement, and then spread all over the world to Australia, now also in the Nordic region to the Sami, where the archaeologists and the anthropologists had been collecting the bones of the dead for over a century, and how this sort of released a crisis within the discipline. Who are we? We think of ourselves as scientists, but we are become grave plunderers. And how can we deal ethically with standing in this intersection of caring for the dead by desecrating the dead? So this kind of ethical dilemma also runs through the book. But to end this short introduction to what I've done, I think what I hope to have achieved also is, in a sense, to place our whole historical scientific culture in a kind of comparative perspective, to invite a reflection of who are we when we engage in history, and what is the ethical implication of this obsessive interest in what has been, in terms of caring for the other, down to the caretaking of the other's corporeal remains. So, thank you.
Thanks very much. Is it possible to lower that? Oh, you're wonderful. Thank you very, very much. Which, even though I adore the sun. Oh, that's good. That's good. That's lovely. Is that good? Yeah. You want a bit more? Yeah, maybe a little bit lower. Sorry.
I know it's always too sunny.
No, right. Now we're going to complain about the sun. Just very briefly, what I've been haunted by in looking at these covers, because first I got Hanna's book and carried it around, and this on the far left is this beautiful haunting face of Eurydice, if I'm not mistaken, right, as she's coming out of Hades, the land of the dead. Is this the woman on the far left in your photograph, in your picture? Yeah, it's Eurydice, and that's, I think, one of the great links between your book and Hans's book. Yeah, but I had the book and carried it around, and I stared at that, and then and I think that's something really beautiful that comes out, and I'm grateful that Eneken did the photograph of the books and put it with black in the background, because then we have the Eurydice haunting us, and it's her face that then connects. So there is that great story, and you both engage in quite a lot of Greek mythology, particularly Hans, but we have Eurydice there coming right out of the dead. So this is one thing to quickly say about commonalities, but I don't want to speak more. I want to give the floor to the others because I have questions, but I want to go last. Yeah?
Thanks. Before I start with the argument of the books, I would really like to express my admiration for the beauty of writing, because these two books are really polished diamonds, and they have this are written with this sense of passion and urgency that I really admire, and thank you very much for this reading experience. So there are many things. I start with Hanna's book, and there are many things to be discussed in that book, as it is relevant for narrative psychology, for literary studies, for cultural memory studies. But for me, the most powerful and also the most innovative aspect of the claim of the book regards what Hanna calls the sense of the possible, and that she also actually talked about a bit already. That she understands as a sense of historicity, and this is the first bridge between Hanna's and Hans's book. So Hanna shows how narratives, both fictional and factual, contribute to our sense, our historical imagination, to our ability to imagine what might be the specific modes of action in specific historical contexts. And by developing our sense of the possible, narratives are politically and ethically relevant because they show, firstly, and this is really most important for me, that it is very difficult for us to have a sense of history of our own present, to orient in it. And I think this has been one of my biggest lessons during these 15 years in memory studies, that it's very difficult. It's very much easier to have these political and ethical judgments about in hindsight, but not in the present. And perhaps the most vivid example for me has always been Nadezhda Mandelstam's remark in her memoir, Hope Against Hope, where she describes how difficult it was for the Russian poet Osip Mandelstam to actually give up his revolutionary ideals, and to understand, like in the 20s and even still at the beginning of 30s, it was so difficult to understand that the choices he had made, the political and the ethical, during the revolution were actually false. So this process of reorientation was very difficult for him. But my question to Anna is actually concerns a different side of the book, and perhaps the conceptual framework and the use of the concept of narrative identity, which you discuss both on the individual and also on the collective levels. And the strength of the book is precisely that it shows how these two levels are linked, in that the individual narrative process of interpretation of oneself and of the world around us takes place within this narrative web or narrative webs, and also is and draws on what Mark has called narrative unconscious. So these different models and templates of understanding the world, or making sense of the world. And Hanna shows very convincingly how these two levels, the individual and collective, are mediated then through these more intersubjective encounters, or this process of storytelling between the individual and its significant others. So this intersubjectivity in a more narrower sense than the collective. Because you use the concept of so you use this concept of narrative identity both on the individual and collective level, but actually on the collective levels, our frameworks such as memory studies would perhaps call it collective memory, or critical theory would call it discursive formations that create subject positions for individuals or even collective identity. So there are other concepts, and I can see that you want to, because you want to highlight the usefulness of this hermeneutic framework, you don't use these other concepts very much. But I wonder if narrative identity on the collective level works exactly in the same way as it does on the individual. So the use of the same concepts kind of might obfuscate the differences in these processes. So my question actually, and I think Greta also perhaps also addressed or warned against like conflating the individual and the collective level of group identity. So my question is, do you see any important ontological differences between processes of narrative interpretation on the individual and collective level? Now, Hans's book is a very ambitious attempt to think the humanities, or what Hans actually calls the human historical sciences, and perhaps you can say later something about why you use that concept, as part of the universal socio-ontological predicament or mode of being with the dead that is shown to be rooted in ancient mortuary cultures and more generally in the preoccupation with ancestry. And Hans already explained the framework, the phenomenological existential tradition, but in that tradition he shows that Heidegger's understanding of human subjectivity and finitude is usually understood to be predicated on subjects facing its own death, so Heidegger's being towards death. But through an against the grain reading of Heidegger, where Hans uses Levinas's and Derrida's critique of Heidegger, he argues then that even in Heidegger, it is the death of the other that actually helps to found human subjectivity and its historicity. And furthermore, Hans claims that historicity as such, including the modern historical regime, is predicated on being with the dead, taking care of the dead, taking care of the bodies and memories. So this reinterpretation of Heidegger and the role of the death of the other is for me the second bridge or point of dialogue between the books, because Hanna also draws attention to the role of intersubjectivity in storytelling as a foundation of individual subjectivity. So just to the fact that our narrative identity is based on the exchange of stories with others. And then I hope others will discuss it more thoroughly. Then Hans, having established this phenomenological framework, philosophical framework, he proceeds to show in a extremely rich and comprehensive analysis how various disciplines of humanities, such as anthropology, sociology, cultural memory, and so on, how they have actually missed the nature of their own inquiries as a mode of being with the dead, which is similar to these ancient mortuary cultures, which in the framework of humanities are often understood in terms of these just superstitious religious beliefs in afterlife instead of this more general ontological predicament. And my question to Hans regards political dimension of this argument that you actually also discussed, but because the thrust of your argument is different, so you don't go into it very deeply. You argue that every form of sociality is actually built on being with the dead, and in discussing the ancestor worship or the preoccupation of ancestry as one of the forms of being with the dead, you also see it as a foundation of political communities. So, and you admit in the book that the call for being with the dead as the foundation of social ontology has this ring of cultural conservatism or even authoritarianism. So you write, and you promise to take up the challenge, I quote on page 65, to try to theorize the phenomenon from a more neutral perspective. And then you do it very convincingly. But I still would like to ask about the practical side of it. So how is it, how do we differentiate modes of living with the dead that are perhaps conservative and exclusionary, and perhaps then more progressive ways or modes if the living with the dead is linked to ancestry and to the bodies of the dead, and perhaps through that also to the land where these bodies are buried. So I know this question of political relevance is very complicated, but if you could say something about that, it would be wonderful. Thanks.
Maybe they can respond quickly, or do you want to go first?
Maybe we go
okay.
and then...
Okay, sorry. Yeah, good idea.
Okay, first of all, I want to start by thanking Siobhan. I think this was a really wonderful idea, and not only because these are two extremely engaging books, but also because they represent what I think what this network has been about. And as you pointed out, they really, their birth has actually been also followed the development of this network. So it's a real tribute there. Beautiful idea. Returning to Hanna's book, which I have been an admirer of since its birth, I would like to say, but for this occasion, I was trying to look at it in terms of this meeting here, the uses and the abuses of storytelling. So this was quite interesting for me to be thrown back into a text with which I was quite familiar, and to say, well, what can it tell us about that? And it will be not a surprise to you that I come back and say, well, probably quite a lot. So Hanna's opening sentence of the book says, stories are indispensable for human existence. And she goes on citing 1001 Nights and saying, storytelling here becomes quite literally the art of survival. Hanna's book argues for a complex idea of narrative which illuminates not only its ethical potential, but equally important, its risks. And it's the risks of narrative that I think that a lot that we have been looking at in our meeting now, and also that Mark introduced very clearly in his keynote. And this is what I would like to talk to today. Is it the case that there are also some stories which threaten human existence, or at least those values which make life worth living? In these times of political crisis, and again, here I would say Andrea's talk on crisis really, and Greta's as well, really helped us think through what we mean by it. But in these times of crisis, and I do use that word, where we are asked to take seriously that, quote, alternative truths might take the place of verifiable objective facts, what can narrative scholars contribute to our knowledge about what I would like to call dangerous storytelling? I would like to say I actually scripted these marks before hearing Mark's comments, okay? What do these tell us about dangerous storytelling? How can we apply our narrative analytic lens to explore the relationship between the actual and the possible? And here I would also like to add the impossible. In Mark Freeman's talk in Paris 2017, he described himself as, quote, unable to pursue intellectual life without also speaking to the political scene. And in his keynote, he actually posed the question, like Lenin, what is to be done? Interestingly, the subtitle of Lenin's 1902 book was Burning Questions of Our Movement. And I think that was actually what Mark was trying to do in his talk, and indeed what we are circling around now. I feel similarly, and a book which is about ethics and storytelling certainly invites contemplations on the current state of affairs in which we find ourselves. How can the study of ethics and of narrative help us out of the mess we are in? If, as Hanna has written, fictional and non-fictional narratives can contribute to our sense of how to live in a historical world in a particular space of possibilities, and if a sense of history is imbued with ethical consequences, what can the study of narrative tell us about how to live in a world where the distinctions between fact and fiction are often blurred? So those are my comments on Hanna's book. Really easy questions, obviously. Now I will turn to my comments on Hans's book, which I would just really like to begin by thanking Hans for having written such a rich, thought-provoking, and deeply scholarly book. I don't think there was a page that I didn't pause on and actually have to stop and think and process again what you were saying and what these and the great thinkers that you were in the company of. But I also have to put myself a little bit more in the picture here before I raise my questions for you. I think that it's important to know who your reader is. And this reader is someone who has suffered two very significant losses in the last 18 months. And so when I am actually posed with the question of what does it mean to be with the dead, these are also very, very personal questions. I lost my mother, who was 86, and I lost one of my very best friends who died out swimming of a brain aneurysm. And these deaths were very different and had very different implications for me in my life. But it must be said that it is a struggle for me every day. What does it mean to actually be with them? And so, I don't think I would be alone in reading such a book with this title, Being with the Dead, in terms of where I am personally placed in relation to this, I have to say, most important topic. So, my first question then, and I have three here, to Hans, is when we talk about to be historical, this is a line from your book, to be historical is to live with the dead. But can we separate what we owe, and you ask, well, what do we owe the dead? But can we separate what we owe the dead from what we owe our dead? As a society, this historical consciousness is important and culturally marked, but mightn't this differ substantially when we reflect on our more intimate forms of mourning? So that's the first question. The second question, and it's quite related, I guess, is again taken from something that you've written here. It says, the one who has died has left our world, the world from which the ones that live can be with him. Therefore, this being with could never qualify as being with in the full sense of the word, and yet it is nothing. Being with the dead, we are inclined to being with the other as we hold them in our hearts. For me, this question is, well, what does being with in the full sense actually mean? Doesn't this always include a strong component of narrative imagination, as we always see in others, not necessarily who they truly are? And indeed, once they're no longer there, they, in a sense, we almost colonize them. That idea of who they are to us, they can't answer back and say, no, that's not me. So what happens in that transformation over time? Do you think that being with the dead, we are even more inclined than usual to be with the other as we hold them in our hearts and minds, and owning that those ideas might indeed change over our own lives? And finally, my last question is, again, taken from, I have to say this book is literally filled on every single page with such thought-provoking questions. So I just chose three that spoke to me. But you have to read it for yourselves. Anyway, so you write, we are them and they are us, as they now become recognizable through our shared pursuit to hold and to save life from the destruction and to comfort it in the face of the threat of disappearance and oblivion. And my question is, does this argument only work in its most abstract incarnation? We know that there are many of the dead, both known and unknown to us, with whom we do not feel we share a common pursuit. Is there any way to reconcile this gap between the more theoretical appreciation of the ongoing nature of humanity and the discontinuity between ourselves and dead others? Doesn't a historical consciousness as well as a personal one tell us that we both are them and that we are not, and that it is equally important to hold both in balance?
Thanks. Thank you, Molly. Here.
Hi. Okay. It's also a pleasure for me to be part of this celebration, really, of two very magnificent books. And what I'm going to do is just very briefly pick out one of the things that I think connects the two books together. They're of course, very different books. And the last time I gave a lecture in Turkey, last year, it was actually in this room, I think, I talked about Heidegger and to the origin of the work of art, and in particular about two sentences from that essay, which are to me important. And the first is when Heidegger says, he's asking the question, what is art, what is the work? And he says, in order to discover the nature of the art that really prevails in the work, let us go to the actual work and ask the work what and how it is. It's very simple, but if you've got a question, ask it. And if the question you have is about art, ask the artwork. He then picks that up a few pages later. He's talking about a painting by Van Gogh. And actually what he says about Van Gogh is a bit nutty, but that doesn't matter. The very simple sentence, this painting spoke, he says. In the vicinity of the work, we were suddenly somewhere else than we usually tend to be. So you ask, and the work speaks. Yeah, it's very simple, but actually, to my mind, it sets an agenda about our relation to artworks, our relation to what cannot reply, but which somehow nevertheless replies. Now, when I was talking about this, it was made clear to me, in fact it was Hanna who told me, that a lot of people present probably thought I was talking literal nonsense, because that which cannot... Sorry? Well, okay. The thing is, I'm willing to inhabit that nonsense, okay? And the question for me is, how is a dialogue possible? And in particular, how is a dialogue possible with what cannot speak to us in a literal sense? And that might be the work of art, and it might be the dead, of course. And that's I don't want to suggest that Hans and Hanna are in any obvious way Heideggerians, despite what Hans said about his early work. But what I want to suggest is that these two books, to some extent, inhabit that question of how is some kind of dialogue possible. And in Hanna's book, for example, I take the question of dialogue, the ethics of dialogue as a kind of ethical imperative, to be one of the cornerstones of Hanna's book. She says, I quote, narrative often functions as a mode of engaging with what we do not know or understand, what perplexes us, unravels us, moves us viscerally and unexpectedly. And I take that point, what we do not know, yeah? What we do not know, what the text might offer us, what the artwork might offer us, is something we do not know. Another passage from Hanna's book, she's talking about the ethics of dialogue, the ethos of dialogue. And she says one of her aims is, I quote, to contribute to an ethics of relationality that articulates the primacy of the dialogic space with respect to individual subjects, our implicatedness in violent histories, our fundamental dependency on one another as beings capable of inflicting and destructible by violence, and the potential of dialogic storytelling to create a transsubjective